All right, start letting everybody in here. Welcome to Powerhouse Arena's virtual events. My name is Chris. I'm the event coordinator. And tonight we are thrilled to be hosting the launch for Break 'em Up by Zephyr Teachout. Thank you everyone for coming. You'll be able to ask questions through the Q&A function on the screen throughout the event, and she'll take them at the end. You can also buy the book at powerhousebookstores.com. I'll put the link in the chat, and it is also on the event page. Zephyr will be in conversation with Astra Taylor, and I'll introduce both of them now. Astra Taylor is the author of The People's Platform and Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone. Her latest film is What is Democracy? Zephyr Teachout is an attorney, political activist, antitrust and corruption expert. Her campaign for New York Attorney General in 2018 was endorsed by Bernie Sanders, the New York Times, and others. She was part of the team of lawyers that sued Donald Trump for allegedly violating the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution. Teachout sits on the board of directors of the Open Markets Institute and teaches law at Fordham University. She lives in New York City. And I'll hand it over. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. It's wonderful to be here with Zephyr Teachout, my sister in weird names.
And we've got it covered.
A to Z, we've got it covered, and democracy-loving comrade at that. So, I mean, this book, Break 'em Up, is, incredibly timely. I think as more and more people find themselves dependent on a smaller number of companies, and we're facing an I think alarming market concentration. All sorts of alarms are going off, all sorts of problems. But you say in the book that part of the problem is that progressives and leftists have not paid enough attention to monopoly. And so I want you to maybe just begin there and talk about that, because I think there's, leftists and progressives spend a lot of time talking about inequality, about the problem of poverty. And when you start thinking about monopoly, it switches over from sort of thinking about even inequality to investment, right? The problem of who has control over investment, questions of sort of power dynamics. And so, I'm very convinced with you, this is something that we need to pay more attention to, but I'd love for you to just spell that out, talk about the basic argument of the book, and then why these issues matter now more than ever in the midst of this pandemic and economic crisis.
Great. Well, thank you so much to the Powerhouse Arena for having me. And I'm just so excited to be talking to Astra, who has one of the most lively and totally engaged minds. She's always both an incredible activist and always questioning. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. And I highly recommend her books and movies. So please watch them. First, I'm going to answer your first question first, just to set the stage. We've got a bunch of people here. Thank you so much for coming. If you think you care about monopoly power, I want to ask you, when is the last time that you went to a march to break up a big company? When is the last time that you basically got all in on a congressional primary because of the different anti-monopoly positions of the two candidates? When is the last time that you occupied the Federal Trade Commission? Mm-hmm. Or if you are in New York, our own, and I know because we're virtual, you could be coming from anywhere, but your own local utility boards demanding that they act on local monopolies. And I bet the answer is no, so that there's a weird disconnect between people thinking that they care enormously about the problem of corporate power and where progressive activism has been. And I think there's a bunch of reasons for that. One, which is true not just of progressives, but for people in general, is that after Ronald Reagan basically took out antitrust enforcement in 1980s, and Bill Clinton decided to keep it that way, a group of economists and lawyers in the Antitrust Academy, enforcers, collectively convinced everybody that they had no business engaging in questions of market structure, that monopoly was a technical issue, that you needed to know about HHI indexes And before you could even stick your nose in this arena, that these were questions for technicians and experts, the priests in the economic realm, and not basic fundamental questions about how our democracy is designed. And one of the effects of that is that people just left monopoly as this technical question in a way that we don't with, say, tax policy or labor policy. We don't say, well, I'm not an economist, and therefore I can't have a view about how workers should be treated. Instead, we say, no, of course I have a view. These are questions about basic humanity and equality. And I argue in the book that right now, corporate monopolies are a new form of private government that are growing in power, a rival form that's coexisting with democratic government and taking over all different parts of our society. Look at Facebook and Google, the big tech is in the news this week, really becoming private regulators, deciding when Mark Zuckerberg makes an announcement about privacy, we all say, oh, the privacy czar has spoken. We should petition him to change his views and really treat them as governing bodies. And they're totally illegitimate. Concentrated private power is not a legitimate way to run a society. So I argue, one, that it is a major threat. Two, that the left has to do a lot more work on actually going at the heart of power. Big corporate monopolies understand that the more territory they own, the more control they can exercise, and the more power they will have. If those of us who are worried about corporate abuses only focus on policies, like what are the particular policy choices, and not on territory questions and power questions, we're always going to be running behind, saying, hey, Pfizer, please do this thing for us, instead of, no, Pfizer, you shouldn't exist. So I argue that we should move from corporate accountability and the framework of corporate accountability to, especially when it comes to these big monopolies, corporate illegitimacy. Amazon should not exist, not Amazon should be a better corporate citizen.
And so, I think you define monopoly in a way, in a more intuitive sense, right? These companies we're dependent on them, they have control of our lives, they wield incredible political power. But that's not necessarily the legalistic conception of monopoly, especially in the wake of Ronald Reagan, which you just hinted at. So maybe a little bit on the term there and what you mean by it, and then how it is conceived in this very limited fashion.
I will answer you, but I see that several people are saying raise my volume, and I wonder if there is something on my own screen that I can do to make that better. Does that work any better for people? Let's see, a new message. I'm going to leave if you can't make her louder. No, that is not any better. Still.
But you sound fine to me and my headphones, so I do want to say that. So it might be on their end.
Hey,
Are you on a Mac?
I am not.
Okay. There might be a sort of setting for your computer internal mic volume somewhere. I just don't know where.
Okay.
But you do sound fine to me.
Okay, I'm getting a text messages about it too. And they say they can hear you fine. So I am and a few people say it's fine. I really don't know what's going on. I'm very, very sorry for those of you who are having difficulty hearing this. I know some of you can hear us both, and some of you can't. And for those of you who are having difficulty, I totally understand your frustration. I will have future events, but I hope you can. I hope most of you can hear me, and I'll continue going forward. All right.
Yeah, really project.
Projection voice. Okay, so Astra, can you just remind me of the question again?
The question was about your definition of monopoly that you are advancing in the book versus the kind of legalistic conception, the definition that's guiding our policymakers post-Reagan, which emphasizes consumers and prices, and not this intuitive sense of, well, who has power, who dominates the market.
Yeah, well, first of all, you as a political actor can use the word monopoly, and that's basically what I was saying in my last comment. And there's this real fight between different definitions of monopoly. A monopoly is a company that can set the terms of exchange. That don't just ask me, you could ask Milton Friedman. He even used the same definition. And so that means effectively that a monopoly can set prices because they want to, not because they are in a place where they have to be negotiating with purchasers or workers. Effectively, a monopoly sits atop a market instead of being inside it. But you don't need to be only one in a market to be a monopoly. When Standard Oil was broken up, it had 65% market share. So it's basically when a company achieves dominance where it's doing term setting. The field that I come from, anti-corruption work, there's a similar kind of definitional fight that's really key. But people don't usually say, oh, well, the Supreme Court defined corruption wrong for 40 years, and therefore I won't use it in the way that makes sense to me. And I think it's really important that we do the same thing with monopoly and recognize the political power of the term and not say, oh, because Reagan judges misunderstand monopoly, I therefore will use the Reagan judges definition. Now, what the Reagan judges, and again, not just Reagan, Clinton, all the Democratic presidents, all the Republican presidents since 1980, their federal trade commissions, departments of justice, what they have said is there's only a monopoly problem if consumer welfare is affected. And the easiest way to think about this is if consumer prices are going to rise. So we don't worry about concentrated private power unless your toothbrush is going to cost more. We don't worry about how it's going to impact workers. We don't worry about how it's going to impact the political arena. We don't worry about how it's going to impact communities with having fewer small and medium-sized businesses. The whole goal of antitrust law, in this view, is just low consumer prices and a little bit more than that, consumer welfare more broadly. And this sort of radically separates us from ourselves, treating us as consumers in one area when in fact we're consumers, but we're also workers. We're also members of a political community. We also have neighbors. So when you look at something like Amazon, which leads to low prices, it may lead to low prices, but people are getting worse wages. So the sort of net effect is not, you can't see just through the consumer lens.
Yeah, and you have a chapter on the racial implications of monopolies, and I feel like that feels especially important to talk about in this moment. We're in a moment of amazing unrest and awareness, I think, about the system of racial capitalism we're in. So maybe talk about that. And I recently read that the estimate was 40% of Black-owned businesses might close, as a consequence of the crisis that we're now in. And of course, we saw something, similar after 2008 in the economic crisis with Black families losing half of their wealth. So yeah, why is this a racial justice issue?
Well, one thing that I ask people, I think this is really important, and I talk about it throughout the book, but I have a chapter dedicated to it, to looking about the interaction between race and monopoly power. And once you understand, you see monopoly as a form of politics and power, it actually becomes even more important to understand how race and monopoly interact. So one thought experiment I ask people to do is imagine the civil rights movement in today's totally concentrated world. The civil rights movement relied on people standing up to concentrated formal white political power that was totally opposed to African-American equality, saying, but it relied on small Black-owned businesses, pharmacists, funeral home owners, Black-owned insurance companies, Black-owned car services, all were key nodes of political power that were central in allowing for really risky, dangerous protest. So right now, if you look at all of those industries, you see that our 40 years of pro-concentration policy has led to basically the bleaching out of those industries. The funeral home industry is now dominated by SCI, consolidated company that is not about to be supporting protests, instead gives half its money to Republicans and half its money to Democrats. In the insurance industry, you've seen a total collapse of Black-owned insurance. Same with pharmacies. Certainly Black-owned media has been devastated by both the collapse in the news, but also consolidation in the news. And so what you see over and over again is that there is this sort of merging means greater concentration of white power. And one way to think about it in contemporary terms is looking at the CARES Act, which you might not think of as a pro-monopoly or an anti-monopoly law, but I see very much as a pro-monopoly law. So if you look at the bill altogether, not at each of its constituent parts, you see that there are short-term supports for small businesses and massive long-term access to cash for private equity, big monopolistic corporations, Wall Street, right? So what does that mean? You were talking about the collapse of Black-owned businesses in the pandemic. As you said, there's been reporting that suggests that as many as 50% of Black-owned businesses might collapse. The small businesses who have 3, 5, 30 employees are being destroyed during this pandemic, and they got these scraps of support, a few months of support. Big business is getting this enormous access to capital. And you might say this looks racially neutral, but of course it isn't racially neutral, because at the same time, who is Mnuchin giving money to? Well, it's the people who already have money, who already come from legacy wealth, who are overwhelmingly white. So there's a huge racial dimension. And I think that we on the left tend to look at something like the CARES Act and say, does it have good things in it? Not to look at it as a constitutional document that organizes power. And it was a constitutional document that organizes power. I had my students read it, and as one of them said, if you just read this as a constitution, it's basically a constitution that gives the Treasury Secretary control over the economy, which I think is a good way to see it. And that is not an approach that we as progressives, and I know people have come from across the political spectrum, but I'm talking mostly to progressives tonight, that isn't an approach that makes sense. We're just setting ourselves up for failure if we keep giving away power at key moments.
Yeah, I mean, Mnuchin earned himself the name the foreclosure king after the last crisis, right? But now he's the bailout emperor. I mean, he has an enormous amount of power. And yeah, small businesses couldn't get that concierge service that big companies got, right? Where they, even that level of access. So I think that's such a core point. And, you know, it inspires the imagination to be like, okay, how would protests be more robust today if we were in a less monopolistic market, right?
Exactly, right, exactly.
So an interesting counterfactual. I mean, this question of power is so important. I mean, so how do you define power? Because I think one of the things you say that's really provocative at the beginning is we've been making this huge mistake by thinking we have power as consumers. And I'm so with you on this, especially when it comes to the digital space. I mean, it's just like, you know, I mean, right, Facebook doesn't care if you quit.
Yeah.
And
we are just indoctrinated in this idea that not only do we have more power as consumers, but we kind of have a moral obligation to use that power first before we're allowed to protest as members of a political community, which is really weird. In law, there's this doctrine called exhaustion of remedies. Like, first you have to do this before you're allowed to bring this suit. And it feels like we've collectively accepted this exhaustion of remedies ideas around corporate power in particular. So basically, nobody asks me to stop drinking the poison local drinking water before I go to the town hall and protest that my drinking water is poisoned. Like, maybe I don't want to drink it, but I don't have a moral obligation. I'm not called a hypocrite if I don't stop drinking it. Of course I go to the town hall first. And yet when it comes to these big corporations that have taken over essential infrastructure roles, there's this just default presumption of either an accusation of hypocrisy, which you'll certainly hear. I am definitely selling this book on Amazon, which is definitely essential infrastructure. I hope you buy it at your local bookstore. But look, I want to sell this book. I want to get these ideas out there. And so of course I'm going to use the essential infrastructure. of our society. But it's not just accusation. I think there's a lot of weird progressive guilt too. So if you say, Astra, will you join me in demanding that Facebook, the marketplace, get broken up and split off from the Facebook, Amazon, the marketplace, Amazon, the shipping and fulfillment services, which would mean they wouldn't be able to use their dominance in one area to build power in another. I think people automatically think, oh, I might want to join you in that, but I'm a Prime member. And I'll feel like I'm being internally conflicted if I do that. I actually think it's really getting in the way of activism. And I feel very strongly that, ethical consumerism has its place. A really effective, targeted, strategic boycott can make a difference. But most of the time, we should just recognize that if we want to change things, we actually have to go at the heart of power and not individually see our role as consumers as the dominant one. I mean, tell me why you said that you really care about this. Where do you see this?
I think, for so many of the reasons you laid out, and I spend a lot of time not as a writer and as an organizer, and so I want us to be strategic and try to wield power. And with Amazon, it's, I think, maybe more confusing for people because you do buy things, you are a consumer. But for example, on Facebook, you're not even a consumer. The people paying money are the advertisers, right? So you're the product. So you don't even have that leverage technically to do a kind of money boycott. You can leave the platform. But I think we have more power as citizens trying to leverage the state to regulate or break up or nationalize or abolish these systems. And so it's a strategic question. It's like, well, where is the power? And trying to wield that state power or that regulatory power is not in tension with your consumer behavior as an individual. And so I think I do want to say, I thought one of the most powerful part of your books was where you lay this out. Well, where is it useful? So going back to the abolitionists boycotting sugar strategically to put pressure on Parliament, going back to the bus boycott. So you're not saying this is irrelevant, but when we begin to fetishize it and connect it to our personal purity, it's a huge obstacle. And I just completely agree. And the hypocrisy charge is one that, ultimately only hits progressives who get sort of photographed with plastic bags. And, this well, I'm assuming, from campaigning. It's just.
I talked to somebody today who was shocked that I use Amazon. It's like, no, as some of you have seen this great cartoon, I participate in society and also want to change it. But it's particularly dangerous with infrastructural monopolies. And that includes not just big tech. We've been talking about big tech, but when you look at something like, what would it really mean to boycott Monsanto, now owned by Bayer, in a merger that we didn't do enough activism against, and even though there was enormous hatred of that merger. What would it mean, like, that you don't participate in a Monsanto grown foods? That's impossible right now. And so when you understand that these have become infrastructural, they actually are part of they're privately run public infrastructure, that is actually the problem. The reason we can't boycott them successfully is because they're infrastructural. In fact, once you break up companies, boycotts actually make a lot more sense, because then you can say, oh, this cereal company is behaving in an ethical way and this one isn't, and there's 50 choices. So if we get the unethical cereal company to line up, we're going to be okay. But when you have three, they all sit and look at each other and say, hey, we're not worried about you boycotting our one cereal company because we're all in this club together.
So where is where is the power? Do you want to say more about that you wish people were wielding? And especially in this moment where I think, we're seeing a wonderful surge of street activism, and we obviously have an election.
I do see this book as part of a growing movement to organize, to focus on power. And it's not at the expense of policy, but it's saying we have to win the power fights in order to win the policy fights. So let's focus on the power fights. And so what that means is, right now, it means there's a real moment with big tech. And get on your Congress members and your state lawmakers, because there's a growing political will, and it can change a lot of people's lives. I mean, think not just about the sellers who are dependent on Amazon, but all the people who work for those sellers. Think about Facebook and Google's sort of duopolistic stranglehold on media. Some of you may have been fighting media consolidation for generations. Right now, we have two companies that basically can, because Sheryl Sandberg feels differently one day, decide to tweak the algorithm in a way that your local paper goes out of business. I mean, it's whimsical power. It's not just cruel power. It's just total crazy level of centralized power. So taking this moment with big tech, I think, is a really key moment. Putting pressure on your attorneys general, some of whom are actually starting to do some really good work in this area, but they have no staff. So, I mean, just to get a little technical, find out, does your AG have a real staff focused on antitrust? And do they need more? Is that a thing that you can lobby for in the legislature? States are so important. New York alone could have stopped some of these mergers because New York has its own antitrust laws. So a company couldn't merge in New York. Well, if it couldn't merge in New York, it wasn't going to merge nationally. And states can have stricter antitrust laws than the federal government. So there's a lot of different opportunities. I mean, obviously, if Joe Biden is elected, and I definitely hope he is, and I hope the news is, the existing news is correct, that is looking more and more likely. But there is a huge question mark about where Biden's going to go on anti-monopoly policy. And is he going to take this moment? It's not an area where he's really engaged in the past.
Right. And you talk about the Democrats not being good on this. I mean, you're very clear. Yeah.
I mean, I got to say, this subcommittee, they were amazing. Pramila Jayapal is an incredible anti-monopolist. David Cicilline, Neguzzi, there's some incredible anti-monopolists. But on the whole, I bet if you sort of looked at your lawmaker, more likely than not, they don't even think about it because you're not bugging them about it. I mean, if you're in New York, pressure Schumer and Gillibrand on this. Schumer had some good anti-monopoly, but a big hole in the middle of his anti-monopoly policy around big tech, which is just crazy. So I think, and he came out with a good policy, but then hasn't been featuring it or focusing on it or using his leadership power to push it. So if lawmakers aren't hearing about it, I mean, you're an organizer. We gotta make it central to everything we do. There's also sector specific work. So it's whether you're talking about tech or ag or banks, which is an area you've done some extraordinary work. I think how much easier your work would be if you weren't up against these basically collectors of cash who run huge parts of our economy and sit on top of it. And you might still run into a lot of bankers you don't like, but your relative power would be so much greater if you were dealing with a decentralized banking arena instead of these kings. I mean, what are your thoughts on that in the bank?
Yeah, I mean, I think your point that, part of the point of monopolies, right, is you can buy off your competition or squelch your competition, and also, you don't have to listen to the angry consumers, right? I mean, so I think this thing of, it's the lawmakers who have power, so focusing on them is a critical piece, because I should have refreshed my memory, but, a few angry tweets from Bernie Sanders got, Amazon to raise some wages. It kind of showed who.
Right. Then there you have an interaction between where lawmakers can use their power and their threatened power.
Their threatened power, yeah.
Right, and that threatened power really matters. I mean, it's an area where we've seen lawmakers just wildly underperform when it comes to labor, not using their potential power to be supporting strikes. It's one of the reasons I thought I was a big supporter of Bernie Sanders in the primary, but he has consistently used his platform to be engaged in labor politics, and showing up in a way that that really matters. But you can also use that public platform in when it comes to pressuring companies with threatened action too.
Yep. So when we talk about lawmakers, I do just want to give you a shout. I wrote a piece in Teen Vogue where I credited you with starting this trend of, Occupy generation people running for office. And so I really think, you were the trailblazer on that, and
well,
so many
thank
people
you.
are doing that. So I think you really, you get
not,
credit.
I realized it's only 3 years. Of course, it seemed like a generation, but it's only 3 years after Occupy. And I was I was on a couple different working groups at Occupy, the legal working group, where one of the things I was doing was going around and talking to activists about how corporate law works.
Yeah.
So, you have to understand how the car works if you want to change how it runs.
So I want to ask you, I want to ask the big things about, the market, but first I do want to give you space to talk about something that resonated with me in the book too, which is the issue of forced arbitration. And it's one of the wonkier parts of the book. It's so important. As an organizer, I work around issues of financial and economic justice. And all of the members of the Debt Collective, a union for debtors that I co-founded, have signed arbitration clauses in their financial agreements for their student loans, you name it, right? What this means is essentially that our legal system is being privatized, like so many areas of our life. And I think we understand privatization in other realms, right? That there's a diminishment of the public sphere. But I don't think very many people realize how this is happening in law at the national level, also internationally, right? We have these international courts that are also private courts. But I just want you to speak about that, because I think it is a huge obstacle to organizing and wielding power. And you do a brilliant job I've kind of been waiting for someone to write what was that chapter, because I see it in my organizing every day.
Well, thank you so much. It was, in some ways, it was a funny chapter to include. In other ways, it was the most essential chapter, if that makes sense. Because if once you're talking about private government, of course, every new form of government has its judicial system. Like, do you remember in 4th grade when somebody said, make a government, and you sort of have to make roads and a courthouse? These are the sort of key elements of government. And we have this growing, and now it's in over half of employment contracts and almost every major consumer contract. You have arbitration clauses where people sign away their right to be in an open court with a judge and jury, with the rules of evidence and the right of appeal, and a judge who is selected by the public. The most essential principle is that you have a judge selected by the public, not a judge paid for by one of the parties. Arbitration is it's so insidious, because even if you say the word arbitration, it sort of sounds like, oh, Astra and I are getting a divorce and we should do something more gentle than
mediation, right?
Right, mediation. It's softer. Can't we all get along? It has this sort of like, it sounds like we're being adults about the whole thing. But the language is really misleading, because it is a secret court system. You have no right to transparency. The judges are paid for by the parties. And in practice, what that means is the judges are paid for by the repeat players, who are the big corporations. They're not bound by the rules of evidence. There's no right to appeal, and there's often real limits on what you can get back. It is an epidemic destroying our judicial system. And the deviousness of it is so extreme, because basically these big corporations did not want to deal with all these amazing civil rights laws that were passed in the 60s and 70s. Worker rights and civil rights laws. But instead of going to Congress and saying, get rid of the Americans with Disabilities Act, it's annoying to us, or get rid of age discrimination, race discrimination, sex discrimination laws, or laws that give workers rights. Okay, those laws are great. We're going to say they're great. We're just going to force you into a forum where in reality, you can't actually do anything about those rights, because you're never going to find a lawyer. It's never going to be worth it. And actually, one of the most problematic things these clauses do now is they also say that you can't band together and collectively bring suits when there's systematic action. So this has so many effects. It means that these rights are, it's not that people's cases are then going to arbitration. It's the cases are going nowhere because it's not worth it to go to arbitration. So it's not like arbitration is actually replacing law. It's that law is getting taken out with the false promise of arbitration. And it is, the other effect is that we're just like increasingly living in this black box society, to use Frank Pasquale's term, where somebody burns their hand into McDonald's because of bad working conditions, and we're not hearing the story. Because one of the functions of open courts is that we all hear the complaints, because anybody can walk in and hear those stories. So it's privatizing justice, but it's also keeping stories secret. And I think and that, I mean, you know, this is an organizer, Astra. Those stories are what make organizing possible. Now you're in mute.
Yeah, I had, you know, I have to give you the floor because I think it's an epidemic. I mean, I do not think people realize how destructive this is. And, you know, an arbitration clause worked its way into a contract I signed recently for a left-wing book publisher. And I refused to sign with this thing because I just said, on principle, you know, we cannot have this, replacement of public civil rights with these.
No.
I mean, anyway, so but it really hinders.
It's truly everywhere. And there's this fantasy behind it. It's great that you rejected it.
Yeah.
Like, the fantasy is that people have a choice. So that they're going to say, oh, I love this job I've got the job that I really want. Yeah. And I'm going to go to my employer and say, I love the job. I'm just not going to sign this contract because later I'm going to sue you for discriminating against me. So you better preserve my right to an open court. That conversation is not going to happen. And it's certainly not going to happen with people who are in the most vulnerable positions in society who desperately need a job. Yeah,
I think this is so true that it's like we're thinking of monopoly as private power, as private governments, realizing they have their own legal regime is really key. And people have probably signed many more of these things than they realize. They're everywhere.
Yes, yes.
So I want people to start thinking of what questions they have. But, you know, you say very clearly monopoly is tyranny. So then I want to provocatively ask you, well, then does that mean markets or democracy? Right? And is that like, so what is competition then, the opposite of tyranny? And your book, you know, talks about the problem with these concentrated markets, but you don't talk about capitalism very much. That's a word that kind of just comes in a few times in the book.
Yeah.
And we're in a moment where we are talking about capitalism a lot as a culture, as Americans, which is unusual. Yeah. And I guess, you know, the question is, you know, does capitalism have a natural tendency towards monopoly? That's what the capital in capitalism does, right? It concentrates. And extracts surplus value and concentrates wealth and power. And so, you know, do we, to solve this problem really once and for all, right? Because people have reined in monopolies before, and then capitalism kept capitalisming, and we're back with this problem again. Or can we solve this within this economic system?
Well, I don't think there is a once and for all. I don't think there is I think that self-governance, which is to me the goal, and I know from your writing that's an essential goal, is people having power over their own lives, being secure, and being free, and having relative equality. These are all essential goals. And for me, that includes markets. And so I actually do avoid the word capitalism per se, because I actually think so many people bring so many different things to it. And in the last chapter, I pull out different parts of what is toxic about our current system and other parts which I think are actually really important. But I'm glad you brought this up, because to me, this is the conversation progressives need to be having, which is, okay, what kind of markets do you want? Who do you want to make shoes? Like, what does that look like? Who makes, and I use shoes, or who do you want to grow carrots? Like, do you imagine New York State being the sort of shoemaker? Do you imagine the federal government being the shoemaker? Do you imagine private companies being the shoemaker? And for me, it's in many arenas, and it is goods specific, is going to be private companies. In other areas, like public education, like, absolutely the government should be doing that. So I think for me, it's a good specific question, but there's an essential role of markets. However, I do think that maximizing profits, and I talk about this, is a sort of toxic, unnecessary feature of modern American capitalist society. And maybe I'll use, it's a sort of a light analogy, but may help people think about it. I use this with my students a lot, is that everybody understands that like marriage or partnership or a long-term partnership, there's a lot of different reasons to enter into it. And one of them is a great sensual life and sex. But it would be totally weird and pathological if you then took from that marriage or long-term partnership was sex maximization. And so the analogy to businesses and markets is that, of course, there's nothing like in itself wrong with people wanting to make a profit. But it's pathological to then take from that profit maximization is the goal of being in a business. So instead, making a profit and treating your workers well and feeling a sense of self-determination and creativity, these are all different reasons why somebody might go into shoemaking. And our current legal system says, no, it's about profit maximization. And to me, that's a key problem. And then financialization, which is where we basically, instead of having systems that push investment into like things that are useful and joyful and necessary, we have money going into money making more money. And then I think financialization is really toxic. But I actually really want to push, those on my my friends and allies on the left to say, okay, so what's your vision of a successful market? For me, it involves unionized businesses and co-ops, but that means that they are private. They're in a private market. It is not the government making shoes. And I think there's a lot of sloppiness around in this area sometimes, like just sort of oh, we just got to get rid of capitalism without saying, well, what do you mean by that? Like, who's making the shoes? We may agree on the profit margin, but what do markets look like? I think we should have markets, and I think they should be decentralized. I think that's important. What's your vision?
I always like to trouble whoever I'm with, so my, thing is, when we, and I spend a lot of time with leftists and anti-capitalists, and I consider myself a socialist, but, to me, there's just all these thorny conundrums of like, well, how do you account for freedom? And I think having markets doesn't, saying there are markets isn't the same as saying a market-driven society, right? Like markets can be part of a society without dominating every human relationship. And, Ellen Wood says that, the great Marxist historian. Yeah. But I think that I would like to say, I think though that bigness is not always bad and decentralization is not always democratic. So, public schools, K through 12, are quite interesting because they're public and yet they're decentralized in a very undemocratic way, and that they're funded by local property tax regimes. So I think this is where, because at first I'm still quite into that formalization of nationalized and decentralized. So this is Zephyr's, the last chapter of her book, right? That we can think these two things simultaneously. Right. And that's what we need: public support for decentralized experiments in terms of green energy and retrofitting our economy. But then, the public school example is an example of that that's problematic. It's sort of done in a bad way. So, we always still have to fight over the principles. But I guess I think there's lots of things I would just like to socialize right off the bat, if I was made dictator for a day. Yes. But I think this question of, well, then how do you make sure that they still respect freedom and and are accountable to communities? I mean, it's still a live question to me.
And answer those questions at scale. And as you may recall, this is one of the great tensions that occupy Wall Street, is sort of different visions of scale. The extreme on one hand, basically people were saying you can't have self-government except at small scale. Mm-hmm. And people were simultaneously saying we need national health care. And the working out the tension between are we even in the same conversation? I think is really important. So I think devolution of some degree of self-governance in the public realm is also important. And that's not what this book is about. Mm-hmm. But you can have state and federal run funding of education, but real devolution of a lot of education decisions. and so I do think that that like living without power has a really toxic effect. It's understandable that people want to feel like they have choices in their lives, and I want people to have choices in their lives, and not just over their own lives, but over their collective lives, and that requires systems where you're not like just all systems are centralized. So I also, as I say later in the book, think a lot of things need to be nationalized, but we shouldn't then have a fantasy that if you nationalize the system, then you don't actually have to deal with the monopoly problem. Like the most nationalized of national systems in this country is the Department of Defense. Nobody doubts that it's public. Nobody doubts that it's national. And yet, now that we have a monopolized federal contractor industry of 5 contractors instead of 65, those five contractors run the show. So clearly we've got to shift funding away from there, but they have enormous power. But if we then do a Green New Deal, and by the way, I love the way AOC and Markey lay out their Green New Deal, because it's very much this. It's nationalization of the policy, decentralization of the implementation. But if you had a Green New Deal that says we're going to have a national policy and we're going to work with 5 contractors, well, Exxon's green arm would end up running the show. So you can't just say nationalize either Medicare or healthcare, which you may prefer over Medicare for all, without saying, okay, but what about pharma? Like, we have to deal with these other power questions. Otherwise, they're going to come back to bite you.
Yeah. And I think that's where left, skepticism of the anti-monopoly discourse comes in, because if you are doing it, if the end that you're seeking is merely competition, then, I can say, well, there's a lot of competing data brokers online buying up my data. I mean, sure, Facebook and Google own the ad market, but, I don't want to be fighting off 1,000 data brokers taking my private data. Like, that doesn't sound like a fun use of my time. I'd rather have, maybe have,
right.
Right. So I think that thing of like, for you, competition is a means to distributing power.
Yes.
Is that right?
So in banking, like, let's take usury.
Yeah.
So what did the big banks want more than anything last time in that cycle? They wanted to make sure that usury law was made federally because they actually felt like they had less power in the states. That's just not more than anything. But that was one of the things they were fighting for, was let's make everything federal because we have more power at the federal level. And just being aware of those kinds of power dynamics, like, it's going to be different in different industries. Yep. They're thinking about power, so we should be thinking about power too.
Yeah. And you have a question. Can you see the Q&A?
Oh, it's different.
Esther Dyson. I like the way you think about markets. Yes.
Hi,
go for it if you can read it.
Yes. So Esther asks, I like the way you think about markets. Can you talk about pricing in externalities, taxing sugar based on the cost of diabetes, subsidizing childcare and care workers' wages? Yes, I think that's, let's see if I can find myself and, thank you. And I'm interested in your question and how you see those two as related, because I think the obvious way to see them as related is that industries with outsized power, which they then plow into lobbying, can basically make sure that the actual costs of their business are not priced in. But you may see a different dynamic there. And I think, yes, absolutely. And I guess maybe this also connects with what Astra is saying. I think sometimes people think that there's an either or between changing laws and taking on power, or a new policy and taking on power. And I do actually think of these as means to an end, that it's hard to have rational policy when you have little mini dictators in the field. And in terms of subsidizing childcare and care workers' wages, absolutely. So I feel so strongly about the incredible work. And I do think that we need publicly funded childcare. You may be asking, I think this is a great example of like, okay, so there's lots of different ways to do publicly funded childcare. Do you have local run school, child care centers, like as a subdivision of schools, or do you like work within the existing arena and be directly supporting existing childcare workers? I actually don't know which I think on those. I believe that we should be paying for childcare. But between those two, those are, I think, really both important possible different market structures. One would be totally public, one would be subsidizing private. I did dedicate the book to my amazing childcare providers, and anybody who's written a book with anybody they have to take care of, whether that be a child or a family member, knows how essential care providers are in any creative endeavor.
Building on that question, Esther's question of externalities, though, you kind of hinted on that when you said, yes, the goods we purchase on Amazon might be cheap, but at what cost?
Right.
And so, what should be included in our conception of externalities as well, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, one way to, I guess it's that there's this wonderful phrase from Nietzsche. I'm going to get it wrong, but because I'm a couple of years away from it. When he's talking about when society falls apart, he's talking about decadence. Mm-hmm. And he says decadence is not just when sort of society starts falling apart, but when people's different parts of themselves are separated from each other and words are taken out of the context of their sentence. There's a kind of like total disconnection. And I think that we have to see markets as a whole, with ourselves as members of a political community, members of a world in which we breathe, drink water, or of a community of health or non-health, purchasers, workers, community members, and see those in an integrated way when we think of markets, instead of saying, here I'm a consumer, and here I'm a voter, and here I'm a worker. And that actual fragmentation at the core of what we as the little atomistic people are is actually one of the ways we've lost our way.
Mm-hmm. Great question about polarization, and can this be the thing that unites us?
Oh, this is so interesting because I really think that the Republican Party as qua party is just awful. Cannot believe how bigoted, racist, how accepting of Donald Trump's corruption the party members have been. When it comes to Republicans, people who identify as Republicans or independents, there are a lot of trustbusters out there. This is absolutely a potentially bipartisan issue, not just because there's people from all different kinds of parties. Independents, Green, Libertarian. Libertarians sometimes take a little work, but a serious libertarian will understand you don't want private government either. It's not just that you don't want, but that it can actually really bring people together. And crazily enough, and kind of excitingly, this is what happened at yesterday's antitrust subcommittee hearing. There were two of the Republicans on the subcommittee who mostly didn't engage in market power questions, but all the other Republicans did. Bach and Armstrong were asking, even Matt Gaetz was asking market power questions about Amazon's abuse of sellers. So it was really interesting to say, okay, this actually might be something that could move forward. It's going to come bottom up. It's not going to come top down, because certainly the Koch brother world is not interested in decentralized power. And just to be clear, Democrats in leadership for 40 years have not been focused on anti-monopoly, but there really is an opportunity here, certainly when you're talking grassroots up for cross-partisan work. I actually, my first chapter is about chicken farmers and Uber drivers, because I really want people to see, like, people are in such similar situations of powerlessness, and it's not urban or rural. It's not it's not like small business owners as against workers, where we see the wrong divisions, and people's position of humiliation in the face of overweening power is across the board.
Yeah, and in that sense, the tech sector, which got so much sort of credit for being novel and disruptive and brand new, is actually replicating these models from other industries and that are hardly innovative, right? Because it fits the pattern so well. So I guess two questions, because we're getting close. I mean, one is maybe tying this to your work on corruption, because that was what your last book was on. And, I think this is another question that gets to this question of capitalism, right? Is the problem that capitalism has been corrupted, or that a system based on the profit motive is sort of inherently corrupt, and there's a deeper problem there. So kind of, how do you think of corruption in this discourse, and how do we draw the line and define it, right?
Yes.
It can be quite controversial, I hear.
Yeah. This actually goes to, I have a few different audiences here, but certainly one sub audience is political theorists, to whom I want to say, stop being so formal in your analysis of what is government. So corruption typically is tied to, when you're talking about public corruption, public government, right? So you say a government actor is acting in a corrupt way when he's using his public power for his own private selfish interests. Well, I think that definition still holds when you're talking about these private forms of government. So that we should have a functionalist approach instead of a formal approach. And maybe one way to sort of tease this out is to say, if you have a mayor of a small town, and the mayor of the town just does whatever the, I don't know, well, take the shoe manufacturer, the wealthy local magnate who's a shoe manufacturer wants. And when the shoe manufacturer says, this is our new policy, that's the policy. And the shoe manufacturer decides to act in a way that makes her incredibly rich by using public funds to subsidize herself. Well, a lot of people would then say, oh, the mayor is corrupt, but the shoe manufacturer isn't because she's private. And I just think that's nonsense. She's acting in a public governing way. And we should basically say, when somebody is using governing power, we can use the appellation of corruption to them as well. And so then think about how that would matter. It means that I can say that when private companies are wielding power over the federal government or state government, they're not just corrupting, they are themselves corrupt. So once they take on that governing role. So I see these two as closely connected, and I think our language has missed that. And in so many areas, we're functional. By functional, I mean, we say, does it look like a duck? Does it walk like a duck? But we're weirdly formal, like, were you elected? Otherwise, you're not government. And that isn't true in other countries. It isn't true here. So that's sort of a part of the theoretical argument of the book, is to look at governing regulation. Amazon clearly regulates its sellers. Monsanto and Bayer clearly regulate farmers. So let's use the language of regulation and corruption. Now, the other way these two connect is, I came to believe that campaign finance reform, which I care about so passionately, changing the way we fund elections, is essential but insufficient if we don't address private power, concentrations of private power. So that these two go together. Because otherwise, it's not true, as some cynics say, that all money will find its, that campaign finance regulations don't matter, that friction in the system doesn't matter. I actually think they matter enormously. I think there's a lot of reason to think they matter enormously. But it is true that when you have extreme concentrations of private power, it's really hard to take on that power without going at the source of that power.
Yeah, it's interesting, because you're making me think, like, individuals, we get this accusation of hypocrisy so quickly, and yet we're reluctant to accuse companies of corruption. It's just not fair. So for a kind of, maybe
they're just doing what they're supposed to do. But
exactly.
Maybe we have an operating system where people doing what they're supposed to do is corrupting.
Exactly. So to kind of end on an up note, I was thinking, just, as you say in the book, this is a battle that has been fought before 100 years ago, right? Or longer. Yeah. And, for example, I got very excited reading recently about the Nonpartisan League, right, which was this sort of populist anti-corporate monopoly group that then ran radical candidates by primarying them, taking advantage of the new primary system. What is there an example from the past that you want to lift up, something we should learn about as we continue the fight into the 21st century?
Yeah. Well, I share your love of the leagues. I just love league also as like a word. So in fact, at one point early on in this, I co-founded an antitrust league as an echo to the thousands of antitrust leagues of the late 19th century that were all over the country as farmers and workers came together to fight against corporate monopolies. And anti-monopoly activism used to be very mainstream. Anti-monopoly was the fundamental question of the 1912 election, like the discussion that you and I started to have, which I think needs to be back on the center, is okay, what do we nationalize? What do we leave to private? What are the kinds of investments that we encourage if we have private, if we're within private markets. So anti-monopoly used to be absolutely central. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt gets a lot of credit, but the real most exciting, most successful anti-monopoly era in American history actually comes out of FDR. And in the second half of his administration, his second term, he really came to believe that the fundamental problems of society couldn't be dealt with unless we took on concentrated private power on Wall Street. And then we had the 30-year era where there was a real strong tradition of saying, we're just not going to even take the risk of too much private power. And we're going to stop concentrations in their incipiency. FDR, it takes a long time, but FDR's policies really find their roots several generations earlier. So the activists of the 1880s and 1890s had an impact on the early Teddy Roosevelt, which then had an impact on the 1912 election, which then actually really got stopped in their tracks by World War I. There's a lot of great anti-monopoly activism in our history, and we're up against some of, titans that are arguably stronger because of the nature of surveillance and the incredible insight into us that these contemporary titans have. And I don't just mean big tech, by the way. John Deere is tracking every move, so the surveillance is everywhere. But I mean, we're at this crucible moment. We can go in lots of different directions, but it's certainly possible to see very serious anti-monopolism joining forces with some of the other exciting movements happening now. I can feel it rising.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Any other final words that you have for the group?
Well, mostly I just want to say thank you for coming to this. And it was so great to talk to you, Astra. I feel like we could talk for hours more on this. I want you to read the book and fight with it. I wrote it because I care about these things. And I think that if we make a mistake and don't engage on corporate power, I'm quite serious about the threat. I do think that it's coming to take over more and more parts of our lives. But read it and fight with me and tell me what you think. And thank you so much for coming. And thank you to the Powerhouse Arena. And thanks for your questions and your patience with my audio. And thanks, Astra.
Great, thank you. This is super informative, super helpful. It'll be on YouTube afterwards if anybody missed any part of it for any reason. Thank you, Astra. Thank you, Zephyr. And thank you for the astute question, for the person who asked the question. And please, everyone, buy the book.
Buy the book. Buy the book.
Oh, here's my last word. Buy the book and buy a second copy, used, whatever, and send it to your Congress member. That is my dream. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.